They say you can't go home again, but they never tell you what happens when home refuses to let you leave. The sign for Havenwood looked the same as it did in my memories, moss-eaten and slightly tilted, as if it had sighed in resignation 20 years ago and never bothered to straighten up. But as I drove past it, the familiar pang of nostalgia I'd been expecting was replaced by a cold, creeping unease. This wasn't the Havenwood I remembered. It was a photograph of it. Miller's Hardware still had the same faded Coca-Cola sign in the window. The crack in the pavement outside the old diner still branched out like a lightning strike. Nothing had been torn down. Nothing new had been built. It wasn't just frozen in time. It felt preserved in amber, unnaturally still. The silence that hung over the town square wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. I rolled down my window, and a faint metallic scent, like ozone after a lightning strike on a dry day, slipped into the car. It was the smell of something sterile and deeply wrong, a chemical tang that had no place among the scent of pine and damp earth. My parents were waiting on the porch, their smiles as wide and welcoming as I'd pictured for the entire 6-hour drive. But as I got out of the car, the illusion shattered. Mom's hug was too tight, a frantic clenching that felt less like affection and more like she was checking to see if I was real. Dad's hand on my shoulder was a little too firm, a grip meant to hold, not to welcome. "Leo, you're finally here," Mom said, her voice a pitch higher than I remembered. "You look thin. Are they not feeding you in the city?" "I'm fine, Mom," I laughed, trying to shake off the weirdness. "It's good to be back. God, has anything changed around here? It's like a time capsule." The shift was instantaneous and terrifying. Their smiles became fixed, painted on things. Dad's hand tightened on my shoulder before he let go. I glanced at my mother and saw it. For just a fraction of a second, her pleasant mask dissolved, revealing a chasm of raw, undiluted terror in her eyes. It was the look of a cornered animal. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the same brittle, beaming pleasantry as before. "Some things are just too good to change, honey," she said, her voice perfectly even. Dinner was an exercise in tension. The clinking of our silverware against the porcelain plates was deafening in the spaces where conversation should have been. I tried to fill the void, asking the simple questions a son asks when he comes home. "So, how's Eli Thorne doing? I was thinking of looking him up tomorrow, maybe Sam too, see if they still waste their afternoons at the old arcade." My father set his fork down with a sharp clink. "Eli's busy at the hardware store. His father's put a lot of responsibility on him. And Sam's got his hands full," Mom added quickly, not looking at me. "It's best to let them be, Leo. You're here to rest, not run all over town." Their discouragement felt less like parental concern and more like a frantic warning. Every attempt I made to steer the conversation back to the town, to old friends, to anything beyond the weather and my job, was met with a wall of polite evasion or an unnerving, deliberate silence. They were a team, flawlessly deflecting my inquiries with a practiced desperation that chilled me to the bone. It felt less like I was catching up and more like I was conducting an interrogation, and my questions were a threat. My gaze drifted from their strained faces to the mantelpiece above the fireplace. Sitting there, nestled between a photo of me in a cap and gown and a porcelain shepherdess, was the old emergency radio. It was a blocky, utilitarian thing from a bygone era, but my attention was snagged by the single red light on its face. It wasn't on. It was blinking, a slow, steady pulse. Blink. 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 It looked like a single, malevolent eye staring out into the room, patient and aware. The sight of it sent a jolt through me, dredging up fragmented memories from the fog of childhood, the smell of dust and mothballs. My mother's hand over my mouth, her body trembling as she pushed me into the back of a closet. The muffled sound of a drill, except it wasn't a drill, it was something else, something worse. Dread, formless, and suffocating, washed over me. "Huh," I said, pointing with my fork. "I'm surprised that old thing still works." The reaction was electric. My father's jaw tightened, and he shot my mother a look of pure panic. "It's for weather alerts," he said, his voice flat and final. "That's all." "Richard," "Clear the plates," my mother commanded, her voice suddenly sharp as glass. The conversation was over, not just ended, but executed. They shut it down with an unnatural swiftness that left no room for argument. As I sat there in the oppressive silence they had created, I knew my initial unease wasn't just in my head. I had come home seeking the comfort of the familiar, but I had walked into a prison of secrets, and its wardens were my own parents. The air was thick with things unsaid, and a blinking red light on the mantel was keeping watch over us all. Sleep was a country I couldn't find the border to. I lay in my childhood bed, staring at the familiar water stain on the ceiling that I'd once imagined was a map of a fantasy kingdom. Now, it just looked like a spreading rot. The oppressive silence of the house was gone, replaced by the ghost of my parents' tension, a suffocating blanket woven from all the things they refused to say. I was adrift in a sea of it, my questions unanswered, my unease curdling into a knot of cold dread in my gut. Then, the world changed. My phone screen read 11:47 p.m. The sound that ripped through the night wasn't a siren. A siren is a warning, a man-made shriek designed to alert and protect. This was something else entirely. It was a sound you felt in your skeleton before you ever heard it with your ears. It was a low, guttural vibration that resonated deep in my jaw, making my teeth ache with a profound, buzzing hum. It grew into a discordant harmony, a chorus of sickeningly sweet notes that scraped against each other, creating a sound that felt alive. It was organic, biological, a violation that bypassed hearing and burrowed directly into my cells. My stomach churned, a nauseating lurch that had nothing to do with dinner. The very air vibrated with its foul music, as if the sound waves themselves were a form of physical trespass. My bedroom door was ajar, and I heard my parents' door fly open in the hall. There was no sleepy confusion, no questioning shouts. There was only the immediate, frantic sound of their feet hitting the floorboards. I crept to my doorway and peered out. What I saw wasn't a panic, it was a ritual. They moved with a desperate, synchronized efficiency, a terrible ballet they had clearly performed countless times. Dad shot the heavy bolt on the front door, his movements swift and certain. Mom was at the living room windows, yanking the thick blackout curtains shut, with such force the rods groaned. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. Every motion was precise, ingrained by years of repetition. This was a practiced terror. My mother moved to the back door, her hand stuffing a rolled-up towel into the crack at the bottom. Her face, caught for a moment in the dim light from the hall, was a mask of pale, grim focus. The terror I had seen flash in her eyes at dinner was now her entire being, but it was a terror harnessed, channeled into this frantic, well-rehearsed lockdown. Suddenly, Dad was at my door. He wasn't looking at me, but through me, his eyes wide and fixed on some unseen horror I could only hear. His hand gripped the door frame, his knuckles white. "Leo," he whispered, his voice a low, harsh command that tolerated no argument. "Get in your room. Lock your door. Do not look outside. Don't make a sound." He didn't wait for a response. He pulled my door shut, and I heard the click of his footsteps retreating down the stairs. I stood in the darkness, the siren's unholy choir pressing in from all sides. His order echoed in my mind, layered with all the desperate evasions from dinner. They didn't want me to know. They wanted me to hide, to cower in the dark and pretend this wasn't happening, just as they clearly had for years. But I couldn't. The fear was a cold weight in my chest, but the need for truth was a fire. The secrecy was its own kind of monster, and I'd been trapped with it all evening. I refused to be its prisoner for a second longer. I waited, counting to 60. The sounds of their frantic preparations downstairs ceased, replaced only by the ceaseless, gut-wrenching wail from outside. My heart hammered a frantic, desperate beat against my ribs, a drum trying to keep time with the siren's sickening pulse. Pushing down the primal instinct to obey my father, to hide under the covers like a child, I turned the knob on my door. It opened with a soft click. The house was submerged in darkness, every source of light extinguished. I slipped out of my room, my bare feet silent on the runner in the hall. Each step down the stairs was a conscious act of rebellion against the terror that screamed at me to run back. The air grew colder as I descended, the foul harmony from outside seeming to thicken, to become a tangible presence in the living room. My destination was the front window, the one my mother had so violently shrouded. I had to see. I had to know what kind of horror demanded such a devout and terrifying ritual. My hand trembled as I reached for the edge of the heavy curtain, ready to pull back the veil on Havenwood's rotten heart. My fingers, slick with a cold sweat, fumbled with the edge of the heavy curtain. I pulled it back just enough to create a narrow slit, a sliver of a view onto the front lawn. The world outside was bathed in a pale, sickly luminescence that wasn't coming from the moon, and in that light, I saw him. It was Eli Thorne, standing on my lawn, wearing the same faded green jacket he'd practically lived in since we were 17. But it wasn't him. His body moved with a horrifying, disjointed cadence, like a marionette whose strings were tangled and being pulled by a spastic, hateful puppeteer. His head snapped to the side at an angle that looked painful. Then his left leg jerked forward, dragging him a few feet across the grass in a motion that was nothing like a human step. As I watched, paralyzed with a mixture of fear and disbelief, his right arm bent backward at the elbow. It didn't break, it simply bent. I heard the sound of it even through the thick glass, not a sharp crack, but a dull, wet pop of cartilage and sinew giving way. His body didn't even register the injury. The tendons in his neck were corded and tight, strained like thick ropes under his skin as his head lolled, guided by some unseen force. Eli? The name escaped my lips as a choked whisper. My rational mind was screaming, trying to find an explanation, a seizure, drugs, some horrific prank. Eli, what the hell are you doing? I called out, my voice louder this time, cracking with strain. At the sound of my voice, the jerky movements stopped. Eli's head snapped forward to face the window. In the same instant, two other figures I hadn't noticed shambled out of the shadows. One was Sam, his lanky frame twisted into a pained crouch. The other was old Mrs. Bloom from down the street, her small, frail body bent impossibly at the waist. They all turned toward me, a synchronized, unnatural pivot. Their eyes were wide, but they were vacant, like polished glass reflecting the dead light. They were empty windows into hollow rooms. Then they began to speak. They chanted my name, a chorus of the damned on my front lawn. Leo. The horror of it was not the sound, but the intonation. It was a perfect, emotionless mimicry of my mother's voice. It was the gentle, loving way she'd always said my name, the two syllables drawn out when she was proud of me. Leo. Hearing that sound come from the slack, dead-eyed face of my oldest friend was a grotesque parody, a violation so profound it felt like a physical blow. The thing controlling them wasn't just making them move, it was rifling through my memories, weaponizing my own love against me. As if summoned by my terror, Mrs. Bloom shuffled closer to the window, her house slippers scraping against the damp grass. Her face was inches from the pane, her expression utterly blank, but her lips parted. She leaned in and whispered a name I hadn't heard or thought of in over 20 years. Barnaby. The blood drained from my face, a cold rush that left me dizzy. Barnaby, my imaginary friend from when I was 5. A scruffy, invisible dog that only I could see. A secret I had forgotten I even had. My parents didn't know. Eli and Sam certainly didn't. No one could know. In that moment, the true nature of the horror crashed down on me. This wasn't just a puppeteer pulling strings. It was a parasite. A psychic scavenger, sitting somewhere out in the dark, rummaging through the most private, locked-away corners of my mind and pulling out my secrets to taunt me with. I stumbled back from the window, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream as I tripped and fell against the couch. I scrambled away, my back hitting the wall. The siren wailed on, the soundtrack to my sanity's collapse. After a minute that felt like a lifetime, I forced myself to look again. They weren't moving anymore. Eli, Sam, and Mrs. Bloom stood motionless on the lawn, like patient, twisted mannequins, their bodies still contorted into those agonizing positions. The only sound was the low, droning chant of my name in my mother's voice. Then, precisely as the grandfather clock in the hall began its first chime of midnight, the siren stopped. The silence that slammed down was absolute, a physical weight. On the lawn, the three figures convulsed. I heard a series of sickening snaps and pops as their limbs and spines wrenched themselves back into alignment. They straightened up, shook their heads as if clearing away a mild headache, and then, without a single glance at the house, they turned and walked away down the street, their gaits perfectly normal. I turned from the window, my body trembling uncontrollably. My parents were standing at the bottom of the stairs, not in a panic, but with a grim, soul-deep exhaustion etched onto their faces. Their lack of surprise was the most terrifying thing I had seen all night. My father looked at me, his eyes filled with a terrible ancient pity. "You looked, didn't you, Leo?" he asked. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation of a tragedy he had tried and failed to prevent. The sun was streaming through the kitchen window, casting cheerful yellow squares on the linoleum floor. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, a scent so aggressively normal it felt like an assault. My mother was humming at the stove, her back to me, while my father sat at the table, calmly turning the pages of the Havenwood Chronicle. It was a perfect portrait of domestic peace, and it was the most terrifying lie I had ever witnessed. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Eli's arm bending the wrong way, heard the wet pop of his own body breaking him. My own body felt like a crime scene, the memory of that violating sound, and Barnaby's whispered name, a permanent stain on my soul. I sat down at the table, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Neither of them flinched. "What was that last night?" I asked, my voice flat and hoarse. My mother turned from the stove, a plate of eggs in her hand and a smile on her face that was a brittle, paper-thin shield. "You must have had a bad dream, honey. City life must be more stressful than you let on." "It wasn't a dream," I said, looking at my father. He refused to meet my gaze, his attention a fortress built around a story about town council zoning. "I saw them. I saw Eli and Sam on the lawn. And Mrs. Bloom. I heard the siren." "There was no siren, Leo," my father said, not looking up from his paper. His voice was calm, but it was the calm of a bomb disposal expert cutting the wrong wire. "Just the wind. It can play tricks on you in these old houses." They were gaslighting me, trying to build a wall of denial around the horror and lock me inside it with them. Their forced normalcy was infinitely more chilling than the practiced terror of the night before. This was the long, slow, waking nightmare. I pushed my chair back, the legs shrieking in protest. I had to get out. I had to find an answer that wasn't a lie. I found Eli at Miller's Hardware, stocking shelves with cans of paint thinner. The air smelled of sawdust and old grievances. For a moment, seeing him there, bathed in the dusty fluorescent light, he looked so completely normal that I almost believed my parents. "Leo Vance! Holy crap, man, is that really you?" he said, a wide, genuine grin spreading across his face. He wiped a hand on his jeans before shaking mine. "I heard you were back in town. How long has it been? 8 years?" "Something like that," I said, my heart pounding. "Good to see you, Eli." We made small talk for a minute, the easy, familiar banter of old friends. He asked about my job, I asked about his dad, but I could feel the truth crawling under my skin, and I couldn't stand the charade. "I saw you last night, Eli," I said, my voice low, "on my lawn." His smile didn't just fade, it collapsed. The easygoing warmth in his eyes vanished, snuffed out like a candle flame. In its place was a flicker of something raw and hunted. For a split second, I saw the real Eli. He was in there, peering out from behind the bars of his own face, his expression one of pure, caged terror. Then the mask of the friendly hardware store clerk slammed back into place, but it was a poorer fit this time, cracked around the edges. "What are you talking about, man?" he chuckled, but the sound was hollow. "I was dead to the world by 10. Long day." "Don't lie to me," I pressed, my voice hardening. "The siren, the way you were moving." "There was no siren," he snapped, his friendly facade cracking completely. He looked around the empty aisle, his eyes wide with fear. "You need to drop it, Leo. You had a bad dream, that's all." He was repeating my parents' script, the official lie of Havenwood. As he said the word dream, it happened. His left hand, which had been resting on the counter, suddenly jerked. The wrist bent at a sickening, impossible angle, fingers splayed and rigid, a perfect, horrifying echo of the broken marionette from the night before. Eli grunted, a sharp intake of breath, and used his right hand to grab his left, forcing it back into position with a wince of genuine pain. He cradled his hand to his chest, his face pale. The proof was undeniable. The puppet master's leash was still attached, dormant but ever present. He wasn't free. None of them were. I stared at his hand, then back at his terrified eyes. I didn't need to say another word. I turned and walked out of the store, the cheerful jingle of the bell above the door a mocking farewell. As I reached my car, I glanced back through the wide storefront window. Eli was already on the phone, his back to the door, his shoulders hunched. He wasn't calling a friend, he was making a report. I had become a problem, and the system that controlled him was now officially aware of it. The drive home was a blur of righteous fury. The lies, the deflections, Eli's twitching hand, it all coalesced into a single, burning point of anger. The fear I'd felt was still there, a cold stone in my stomach, but rage was now the fire wrapped around it. I bypassed the house and went straight to the garage. The door was open. My father was standing at his workbench, meticulously organizing screws into a plastic tray, his back to me. It was another act in his grand play of normalcy, and I wasn't going to applaud. "He's a puppet, Dad," I said, my voice echoing in the concrete space. "I saw it. His hand just did it again. You're lying to me, both of you." He didn't turn around. "Go back in the house, Leo." "No," I said, stepping further into the garage, the smell of oil and old wood thick in the air. "No more lies. You're going to tell me what's going on in this town. What was that thing last night? What did it do to him?" He finally turned, and the man facing me wasn't my quiet, reserved father. His face was a mask of primal rage, the fury of a trapped animal that has been poked one too many times. His lips were pulled back from his teeth in a silent snarl, his eyes blazing with a desperate, cornered fire. "You want to know?" he snarled, his voice a low growl I'd never heard from him before. He took a step toward me and I instinctively flinched back. "You think knowing will help? Knowing is the cage, you damn fool." With a roar of pure, helpless frustration that seemed to rip from his very soul, he spun around and slammed his fist into the drywall next to the workbench. The wall gave way with a sickening crunch, plaster dust exploding into the air. He left his fist there for a moment, his whole body trembling with the force of the impact. When he pulled it back, his knuckles were split and bleeding, bright crimson beads welling up from the raw flesh. He stared at the blood as if it belonged to someone else, his chest heaving. It wasn't just anger, it was a violent outburst born from decades of suffocating terror. His rage seemed to drain out of him then, leaving behind something older and more brittle. He sank onto a wooden stool, cradling his wounded hand. "When I was 10, he said, his voice now raspy and hollow, "it was the Millers. They lived 2 houses down. Not the ones who run the hardware store now, their grandparents." The siren went off. My father pushed me under the bed, told me not to make a sound no matter what I heard. He looked up at me, his eyes dark with the ghosts of memory. "But you can't not hear it, Leo. The sound gets inside the walls, inside your head." I heard the windows break. I heard Mr. Miller screaming. Then I heard his wife, Helen. She wasn't screaming. She was begging. She kept saying, "Not his face. Please, not his face." And then she started making these sounds, sounds a person shouldn't be able to make. He shuddered, a full-body tremor. My father held his hand over my mouth for an hour, even after it was quiet. He just knelt there, crying silently in the dark. The next day, Sheriff Brody's father told everyone it was a gas leak. A tragic accident. We didn't have a secret to keep, Leo. We had a trauma to inherit. The weight of his words settled on me, crushing my anger into dust. This wasn't a conspiracy he was a part of. It was a generational curse he had been forced to bear. My mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale. She must have heard the shouting, seen the hole in the wall. She looked from my father's bleeding hand to my stunned face. "This is why we didn't want you to come home," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "This is why you have to leave. Your questions, they're dangerous. They upset the balance." "Balance? What balance?" I shot back, my voice cracking. "Living in terror? I'm calling the sheriff. I'm calling the state police. This ends." "No!" My father was on his feet again, his face a mask of pure desperation. "Leo, you don't understand the rules." "Then tell me!" I yelled, my last shred of patience gone. "Tell me the goddamn rules!" My father looked at my mother, a silent, agonizing exchange passing between them. He took a deep breath, the confession of a man condemned. "It's not us we're afraid for," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's you." And that's when the full, desperate truth, more horrifying than any monster, began to spill out. My threat to call the sheriff died in the suffocating silence of the garage. The fight drained out of me, leaving a hollow space where my anger had been. My last hope was the library. Facts, history, records. There had to be a paper trail, an official account of this madness that I could take to someone, anyone, outside of Havenwood's suffocating grip. The Havenwood Public Library smelled of old paper and lemon polish, a scent of quiet order that stood in stark defiance of the town's true nature. Mrs. Albright, the librarian, greeted me with a smile so bright it felt predatory. Her hair was a perfect silver helmet, her posture ramrod straight. "Leo Vance, what a pleasure to have you back among us," she cooed, her eyes scanning me with an unnerving intensity. "Doing a little research on your hometown?" "Just looking through some old newspapers," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "How wonderful! Preserving our history is so important." Her helpfulness felt like a performance, and I was the sole captive audience member. I spent an hour in the archives, the musty scent of decaying newsprint filling my lungs. I pulled up the records for the years I remembered the drills, the nights my father now confirmed had been siren nights. I found the corresponding obituaries. A gas main explosion at the Miller house. A tragic fall down a flight of stairs for old Mr. Abernathy. A fast-acting infection that claimed the Peterson family. The causes of death were mundane, varied, and utterly plausible. But the dates, when plotted out, formed a terrifying pattern. They were a constellation of convenient tragedies, each one orbiting a night the siren wailed. As I was leaving, my head swimming with names and dates, I paused by the main desk to retie my shoe. Mrs. Albright was on the phone, her back to me. Her voice, stripped of its saccharine warmth, was low and efficient. "Yes, it's Richard Vance's son," she said. "He was in the archives, looking at the obituaries from 98-03. He's connecting the dates. You were right to be concerned. He's becoming a problem." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The librarian wasn't just a keeper of books, she was a monitor. The entire town was a network, and my questions were tripping its alarms. When I got home, my father was waiting for me in the living room. The fight was gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound, weary resignation. He'd seen my face, heard the dead end in my voice. He knew my trip to the library had only built the walls of my prison higher. "You won't find the truth on microfilm, Leo," he said quietly. "Come with me." He led me down to the basement. It was a normal cellar, smelling of damp earth and laundry detergent, filled with forgotten furniture and dusty boxes. But at the far end, behind a stack of old paint cans, he pushed on a section of the cinder block wall. It swung inward with a low groan, revealing a small, dark space. He flicked a switch, and a single bare bulb illuminated the room. It was an archive, but not of paper. It was a museum of failed hope. My father gestured to the shelves lining the small room. My eyes struggled to process what I was seeing. Tacked to a corkboard was a child's sneaker, a faded cartoon character still visible on the side. The canvas was dark with a dried, brownish stain. Next to it, preserved in a plastic bag, was a frantic, unfinished letter, the handwriting growing more spidery and illegible until it trailed off the page mid-word. On a shelf sat a row of manila folders, but my gaze was caught by a single human fingernail, cracked down the middle, taped carefully to an index card. Below it, in my father's neat script, was a name, Sarah Peterson, attempted to mail letter, the 12th of April 98. This was the room of evidence, a tomb for every escape attempt. Then my blood ran cold. My father pulled a folder from the shelf and handed it to me. On the tab, in the same neat script, was my own name, Leo Vance. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were pages of notes. LV asked about the Thorn Boy. LV noticed the radio. It was a surveillance log of my own homecoming. But beneath the notes was something else, a piece of paper, preserved in a plastic sleeve. It was a drawing, done in thick, waxy crayon. I remembered making it. I must have been 4 or 5. It was a crude stick-figure portrait of my family, smiling under a bright yellow sun. Except it wasn't the sun. It was a solid black disk hanging in the sky. And coming down from the disk were faint, scribbled lines, like rain, connecting to the heads of my family. Connecting to my head, the world tilted, the strings. I had drawn the strings. I was never just an observer. I was never a visitor returning to a town with a dark secret. I was born marked. I had always been part of this. You see now? My father's voice was a ragged whisper behind me. There's no getting out. I can still try, I choked out, my eyes still fixed on the horrifying, childish drawing. I can run. Yes, he said, and his hand landed on my shoulder, a weight of pure despair. You can, and that's the final rule, Leo, the perfect trap. He looked me in the eye, and what I saw there shattered the last of my resolve. If you run, if you expose this town to the outside world, it won't come for you. It will let you go. But it will come for us. It will come for your mother and me. And it will make us pay for your escape, while you are forced to live, free and safe, with the knowledge of what it's doing to us. That is the cage, son. It's not the town. It's us. The basement felt like a tomb, the air thick with the dust of failed escapes and my father's soul-crushing confession. The perfect trap. It wasn't a wall of stone, but a wall of love, and it was more inescapable than any physical barrier. But there was one last door I had to try, one final desperate hope. Sheriff Brody. He was the law, the one person whose job it was to serve and protect. I found him at his desk in the small, wood-paneled station, staring into a half-empty mug of coffee as if it held the answers to the universe. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slumped with a weight that had nothing to do with age. He was a man hollowed out from the inside, leaving only a shell behind. When I finished my frantic, whispered story, the siren, the puppets, the archives in my basement, he didn't look surprised. He didn't call me crazy. He just sighed, a deep, rattling sound of utter defeat. He swiveled in his chair and unlocked a filing cabinet behind him. It wasn't filled with case files. It was his own version of my father's archive. He pulled out a thick binder and slid it across the desk to me. It was filled with copies of letters to the state police, the FBI, even a state senator. It was a meticulously documented history of his own attempts to get help. Tucked into the back was a faded newspaper clipping, a small article about a single-car accident on a highway 100 miles from here. The victim's name was Hannah Brody. "My little sister," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. I thought I could get her out. I put her on a bus, told her to never look back. I made a few calls, pushed a little too hard, tried to make some noise. He tapped the clipping with a thick finger. A week later, her brakes failed on a clear, dry day. They sent me the accident report. Very thorough. It was a message, Leo. The system protecting this place isn't just local." He leaned forward, his eyes finally meeting mine, and they were the eyes of a man who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. "Now for the part that's going to break you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's not that the government won't help, it's that they won't let anyone interfere. They know everything." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. "What are you talking about?" "Havenwood isn't a tragedy, son. It's a laboratory," Brody said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "A long-term, highly classified containment zone. They're studying it. The siren, its control over people. They see a biological weapon with unlimited potential. We're not citizens they've failed to protect. We're lab rats in the most important experiment in human history. The only thing they care about is that the rats don't get out of the maze." My world, already fractured, shattered into a million pieces. The secrecy, the coordinated lies, the perfect trap, it all made a terrible, cohesive sense. This wasn't a curse, it was a quarantine. I stumbled out of the sheriff's office into the afternoon sun, my mind reeling. The tidy storefronts and cheerful flower boxes of Main Street now looked like the set dressing for a prison. As I stood there, lost, a car pulled up to the curb beside me. It was Eli's beat-up pickup truck. He was in the passenger seat. Sam was driving. "Hey, Leo," Sam said, his voice unnervingly pleasant. "Hop in. We need to talk." I hesitated, but there was no point in running. I got in the back. The friendly warmth they'd always had was gone, replaced by a chilling, placid emptiness. This wasn't a conversation between friends. It was an official visit. "We heard you've been asking a lot of questions," Eli said, not looking at me, just staring straight ahead. "Talking to your dad, to Brody, it's not helping, man." "It's about loyalty, Leo," Sam added, his voice perfectly synchronized with Eli's in tone and cadence. "This is our community. We protect it. We protect each other. When you stir things up, you put everyone at risk." As he spoke, Eli reached back and patted me on the shoulder, a gesture that should have been reassuring. But the moment his hand made contact, I felt a cold, prickling jolt, like a phantom limb being touched. It wasn't a physical sensation. It was deeper, a faint, tingling echo in my nerves, as if the strings I'd seen in my childhood drawing were being tested, checking me for a connection. I flinched away. They both noticed. "It's so much easier when you stop fighting," Eli said, turning to look at me at last. His eyes were hollow, the eyes of a willing prisoner who has forgotten what freedom feels like. "You'll see, you get to keep more of yourself that way. You can be a part of this. We'll help you." The invitation was sickeningly clear. It wasn't a threat, it was a recruitment pitch. They were offering me a place within the system, a way to manage the horror instead of being broken by it. Assimilate, they were telling me, or be destroyed. Night fell on Havenwood, not as a blanket, but as a lid being lowered onto a box. The dread I felt wasn't the frantic, questioning terror of the night before. It was a cold, heavy certainty, a resignation so profound it felt like a new state of matter. There was no escape. There was no cavalry. The monster wasn't just at the door. It owned the house, the street, the whole damn world as I knew it. My fight for freedom was over. It had ended in a dusty basement full of tragic souvenirs and in the hollow eyes of my oldest friends. When my father began his nightly ritual, I did not retreat to my room. I stood up from the couch and walked to the front window. He paused, the heavy bolt in his hand, watching me. I didn't look at him. I simply reached out and drew the thick blackout curtain, the fabric heavy and final in my hand. I moved to the next window and did the same. My mother came into the living room, a rolled-up towel in her hand, and stopped, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. I took the towel from her, knelt, and pushed it firmly into the gap beneath the front door. I was not surrendering. Surrender implies a battle lost. This was something else. This was assimilation. I was learning the catechism of my cage, performing the sacred rites that kept the flimsy walls of our sanity from collapsing completely. My movements were precise, efficient, and hollowed out. I was a new gear being fitted into an ancient, awful machine, and my only choice was to turn smoothly or be ground to dust. My parents watched me. their faces etched with a sorrow so deep it was almost unreadable. They had spent 20 years trying to protect me from this, only to have me return and learn the steps to their terrible dance in a matter of days. My father bolted the door. My mother checked the latches on the windows I had just covered. We were a team now, a silent, grim unit bound by a shared, unspeakable truth. We sat in the living room, cloaked in a darkness broken only by the single, blinking red eye of the emergency radio on the mantel. The silence wasn't tense anymore. It was funereal. My mother held out her hand. In her palm were two small foam earplugs. They were the same kind I'd seen my father use in his workshop. She wasn't just offering me a way to dull the sound. She was offering me my uniform, my official induction into the ranks of the damned. She was anointing me as an inhabitant, no longer a visitor, a prisoner, not a guest. I took them from her, my fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was cold. I didn't put them in. I wanted to hear it. I needed to hear it, to face it, with my eyes open, a conscious participant in my own internment. The fight for the outside world was over, but a new struggle was just beginning, the fight to survive inside my own head. At 11:47 p.m. it began. The sickening, organic wail slithered through the walls, a sound that vibrated in my bones and scraped at the edges of my consciousness. It was a sound that unmade things. My parents flinched, their bodies tensing with Pavlovian dread. My father squeezed his eyes shut. My mother began twisting the hem of her shirt, her breathing shallow. I did not flinch. I sat perfectly still, a vital new component of the system, my presence now a part of the ritual. I was the returned son, the failed escapee, the newest link in the chain. I was no longer fighting the horror, I was a part of it. The sound swelled, the discordant harmony pressing in, searching for cracks in our fortress and in our minds. I looked down at my hands, resting on my knees, and for a fleeting, horrifying moment, I saw them. They weren't real, not in the way the lamp or the table were real. They were faint, shimmering outlines in the dim light, like heat haze rising from pavement. Gossamer threads of light attached to the tips of my own fingers, leading up into the darkness. They pulsed with a faint energy, in time with the siren's foul rhythm. The strings. They were already there, or perhaps they had always been. My fight to be free of Havenwood was over. My struggle to remain Leo Vance, to keep a tiny sovereign piece of my own soul while tangled in the strings of the puppet master, had just begun.